comments, those questions that come up. He's got about 45 minutes to an hour presentation, and this is part 1 of part 3, so it's going to be a real deep dive. This is a course that he normally charges for. He extended the invitation, the offer to us as Light Cellar community to learn from him, and I'm very grateful for that and very excited. So Rob has been in the field, this field, permaculture, for a number of years, and I'm just winging this. I could read your bio, but I realized I didn't pull it up. So anyway, along with his wife, Michelle Avis, they have run Verge Permaculture for a number of years, and they have literally helped thousands of people get established in this way of life, this beacon of light to help us out of the predicaments that we face as a society. And it goes much, much, much beyond just growing food, although that is kind of a foundation, a cornerstone. We're going to learn all about that. He's also recently developed another company called Adaptive Habitat, which is, you'll probably mention that, kind of more design consultancy around how you can set your home, your business, whatever it is, your space for more optimal living, more in harmony with nature. This is something that I know we all want. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob right away. And yeah, without further ado, let's dive in. So thank you everyone again for being on this call. Thank you again for Rob sharing his knowledge, his wisdom. Keep those questions coming. And yeah, looking forward to this next hour.
Great. Malcolm, if I get you to just make me co-host, that'd be great. And then I can have some controls. That'd be great.
All right, there we go.
Perfect. And then do you want to just maybe spotlight my video there and be good to go?
Okay, so you are now the host.
Okay, awesome. Okay, folks, thanks so much, Malcolm, for the introduction. My name is Rob Avis, and excuse me, I will just start by introducing myself, let you know kind of how I got here, and then give a little bit of an introduction before we get into the content tonight. So I'm a mechanical engineer. I started off in, well, if I go back far enough, I'm actually Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. So I grew up in a cake factory. We had a 40,000 square foot industrial food facility growing up. And so I'm originally from industrial food. I then got my engineering degree. And then from there, I went to industrial energy. And I worked in Calgary's oil and gas industry, bringing in natural gas to people's homes and oil to refineries to our cars. So very different than what I'm doing right now. And I remember being in my office, learning about, getting ready to take down a massive swath of trees, of all things, to bring in a new pipeline so that we could have natural gas in our cities. And I felt really conflicted about it because I couldn't really criticize what I was doing because I was also the consumer on the other end buying the product. And so I couldn't criticize that industry if I was supporting it as a consumer. And I felt kind of stuck in a corner, so to speak. And sure enough, serendipity struck. And actually, a mutual friend of Malcolm's and mine sent me a video, Rob Sinclair. You probably know him if you're part of the Light Cellar community. And the video was called Greening the Desert. And it's still on YouTube today. And if somebody wants to find it on YouTube, you can stick it up into the chat. That 5-minute video changed the course of my life and my wife's life forever. It basically depicted a gentleman named Jeff Lawton that took a meaningless piece of desert, hypersaline soils, lowest place on earth, completely desertified, and he transformed it into a self-regenerating ecosystem. And so being an engineer, I got my calculator out and I figured out how many hours of life energy I'd been on the planet and how many I might have left. Turns out that most of us live on an average about 600 to 650,000 hours. And I had burned through about a third of those at the time. And I said, you know, what is it that I want to say that I had achieved at the end of my life with the hours that I was allotted on this planet, in this amazing life? And do I want to be maintaining status quo? And the answer resoundingly came back no. And so I called my wife and said, we're quitting our jobs. We're going to travel around the world. We're going to retool our careers. And so being that we were in the energy industry, she's also an engineer. We went to Denmark and we learned everything about renewable energy. We were really concerned about peak oil at the time. And so we thought, well, we understand energy. Let's go learn about what the alternative to fossil fuels is. And when we got to Denmark, we were blown away by the fact that this country back in the 1970s, during the oil embargo, had a decision to make. They had a fork in the road. Either they had to get off oil. They didn't have a choice. So it was either move to nuclear power or develop an industry that had never been developed before, which is wind power. And so the birthplace of wind is Denmark. And we went to the not-for-profit institute called the Folk Center, where Vestas, one of the largest wind turbine companies on the planet, was born, and still operates turbines that was built back in the 1970s. And so what we recognized was that the energy problem was actually not that hard. And while the rest of the world was telling, especially Calgary was saying that we couldn't transition off of fossil fuels, Denmark was doing it. And through all of our studies, what we found was that the food that we eat actually represents a larger footprint than the energy that we consume. In fact, agriculture as a whole right now has contributed 2 times the amount of GHG in the atmosphere when compared to all fossil fuels. And so we quickly learned that if we didn't get an understanding of how our food was grown, we were in trouble. And so this word permaculture came back up again. And we decided that our next trip after Denmark would be to learn organic farming and permaculture. And so we came back to North America. I had converted a Volkswagen van to run on vegetable oil. And we traveled through the United States and Mexico, going to as many farms as we could and trying to learn the most that we possibly could about the food system, keeping in mind that I was from industrial food. So I'd figured out how to get off industrial energy, or at least how to transition my career to renewables. And now I wanted to learn more about the food system, kind of taking me back to my earlier childhood, growing up in a cake factory where we would produce anywhere from 20 to 100,000 cakes in a day, like full on industrial food, not good for you, no nutrient density whatsoever. And so we started learning about permaculture, and that's when we kind of really grabbed a hold of something. And we came back to Calgary. I remember driving across the border of BC and Alberta and saying, Michelle, what the heck are we doing coming back to this province? There's so many rednecks here. And I could not have been further from the truth. Calgary was full of what I call in the closet greenies, people that were wanting to come out of the closet and express their concern about the world and do something positive, but they didn't have an outlet. They were scared to admit it to their friends because there's this kind of, I don't know, subculture in Calgary, at least when I was back in the oil and gas industry, that you wouldn't want to, venture too far from the industry because it treated everybody really well. You got paid a lot of money, and it was important that you kept your job. So anyways, the rest is kind of history. We've been teaching for the last 10 years. As Malcolm said, we've literally taught thousands of students right across the country. We just finished a global permaculture design course through this COVID challenge that we're all in. And I'm really stoked to be here. Malcolm got in touch with me and said, hey, do you want to collaborate on something? And I said, heck yeah, let's do an intro course. And so I've been kind of adjacent to the Light Cellar community. I get some products there from time to time, and I love what they stand for. And it just felt like a really great opportunity to come and speak to you guys tonight. So now that people are continuing to come in, I'm not really monitoring the Facebook chat. So if questions come in, I'm sure Malcolm will relay them over to me. But if you're on the Zoom side of things, please introduce yourself. I found after teaching over 300 students over the last 3 months on Zoom, the same platform, it's really important for you guys to build community while you're here. So introduce yourselves to each other. I have a hunch that if you're coming to a permaculture course and you're part of the light seller community, you're pretty much part of the coolest community on the planet. And so you probably should get to know each other. And so introduce yourself in the chat window. Let me know how you found out about permaculture and one thing you hope to get out of tonight or the coming 2 sessions after this. We're going to be going through permaculture for 3 sessions. I'm going to try and do about 45 minutes to an hour of teaching, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A to get your questions answered. And so let's get into it.
And thanks a lot for moderating. Once I turned it over to you as host, more people will be coming in. So thanks for taking care of that.
Yeah, and I'm going to make, oh, okay, you don't have co-host capabilities. Okay, no problem. I'm watching.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on Facebook for us here.
Perfect. And if you guys want, if you're on Malcolm's newsletter and you guys want the slides, I'm happy to send them to him, and I'm sure he'll be able to oblige. If that, how's that slide set coming through there? Is that okay, Malcolm?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's start with what permaculture is. This is a quote from Bill Mollison. Bill Mollison was the founder of permaculture. He's now passed on, and what a legacy he left. He lived many different lives, and the last life that he lived was as a permaculture, the permaculture creator, I guess. So him and David Holmgren basically developed the concept. I'm just going to open up these folks in from the waiting room here. And basically, permaculture is a philosophy of working with rather than against nature, of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless labor, and of looking at plants and animals and all their functions rather than treating any area as a single product or system. So that's a pretty dense definition. Let's break it down into a couple of things here. So number one, I can pretty much guarantee that all of you have thought this thought, but have never put words to it. And permaculture directly deals with this thought, but turns it into more of a positive thought than the way that it's worded in most people's minds. If you are reading Facebook right now, if you're on CBC, if you're on any of the news channels, and even if you're within environmental circles, the sentiment that most people feel right now globally, if you're paying attention to what's going on in the world, is that humans are inherently destructive. It's probably a thought that you've had, but you may not have put words to it. And so permaculture kind of flies in the face of that sentiment and basically says, well, how can humans be just as positive as they are negative? And permaculture gives us the tools to be able to do that. So if the most negative thing on the planet is the nuclear bomb, then what's the most positive? And it doesn't just focus on growing food. It looks at how we build shelter, how we collect energy, how we grow our food, how we harvest water, how we deal with waste and turn it into resource, and how we build community. Somebody was saying they were interested in building conscious community. Well, most of the successful conscious communities that have formed around the world that are still in operation today are fundamentally designed using the DNA of permaculture. And so there are obviously lots of examples of how humans are really destructive, but there are a ton of examples around the world, both in indigenous culture, but even in some emergent cultures as well, where humans show that they can be just as positive as they are negative. And so the difference between those two really come down to the design of how we set our communities and our households up. And so Bill Mollison wanted to create a design system similar to engineering or architecture that combined all the things that we needed to be able to bring into one design system in order for humans to be just as positive as we are negative. And so that's a big idea, and it's going to take us 3 sessions to kind of really drill down into what that means. And as we get further and further into the concept, I'm going to give you guys some tools that will allow you to apply this in your day-to-day life, whether you're on a farm or in an urban homestead, or urban house, in an apartment, because you don't do permaculture, you use it within what you do. And that's a really important distinction. And so it doesn't matter if whether you're a fireman, or you own the light cellar, or you run a farm, you can apply these ideas in the way that you do things from day to day. So I want to talk a little bit about energy, because I think it's really important. One of the reasons that we left the energy industry was because we were very concerned about the state of the energy industry. I got informed about peak oil when I was just before I left the energy industry, and it consumed me. And I just actually made a video on YouTube that was basically titled, "Will COVID bring on peak oil again? Or will it bring on peak oil?" And so when you start understanding how dependent we are on fossil fuels for everything that we do, and how difficult it is to move away from them, it really starts to open your eyes. And so let me just give a couple of examples. Right now, every calorie of food that we consume, they're actually kilocalories. They're displayed as calories on our food, but they're actually kilocalories. So they're off by a factor of 10. Every calorie of food that we consume requires 10 calories of hydrocarbons to produce it. So that's in the planting, the herbicides, the fertilizers, the plowing, the harvesting, the transportation. Sometimes grain, even in our province, has to be dried in a natural gas dryer. Then we transport it, then we process it, then we package it, then we ship it, then we send it to a store, and sometimes that's in refrigeration. And then from there, we take it home and we cook it. Now, if we were all coyotes and we had to expend 10 calories of energy for every calorie of food that we consumed, we'd all starve to death. And I was literally just on an industrial farm last week interviewing them, and they were telling me how much fuel they use in a year, and it was absolutely mind-bending. And it's not just the diesel fuel that runs their tractors. The amount of energy embodied in nitrogen-based fertilizers is absolutely intense. And so in 1 barrel of oil, and the world right now, just before COVID, was consuming 96 million barrels of oil a day. That went down by about 25% during the COVID crisis. And so it's in the 70 million barrel of oil a day, which is why oil got so cheap. But 1 barrel of oil is equivalent to 25,000 man hours of labor. Okay, so if you had to replace all of the energy that we currently consume, and the average person consumes between 10 and, I think it's about 100 barrels of oil a year or something like that, which would be equivalent to, and depending on how much you consume, anywhere from 50 to 150 energy laborers working for you 24/7. So in order for us to live our modern lifestyle, if we were back in Egyptian times, each North American would have between 100 and 150 laborers working for you 24/7. And so as you start to remove that energy source from the equation, it basically means starvation. It means that we can't heat our houses. It means that we're not going to be wearing clothing. And so it gets pretty dire pretty quickly. And if that wasn't enough, the world is set to reach peak phosphorus by 2030. Which is one of the most important agricultural inputs on the planet right now. And it's coming to an end. There's really only 3 places that produce phosphorus: so the United States, China, and Africa. And only Africa is still exporting phosphorus. The other 2 countries that I mentioned refuse to export it because it's an element of national security as well as food security. And so phosphorus is an issue. Right now, and I promise I'll get positive. We have to kind of create a context and start with where we are globally right now in order to create a case for action. Right now, every ton of grain that gets produced in a conventional way releases up to 7 metric tons of soil into the ocean through erosion, which is why we have all of our dead zones. And I mentioned earlier that the amount of carbon that agriculture emits is now double when compared to all of the fossil fuels burned since the beginning of fossil fuels being burned, which is unbelievable because climate change typically gets blamed on fossil fuels. But in reality, the majority of the carbon in the atmosphere right now is a result of industrial-based agricultural practices. And we can get into that a little bit later in detail if you guys are interested. So if traditional agriculture, like hundreds of years ago, was labor intense, industrial agriculture is energy intense, and permaculture is information and design intense. And so we want to design the work out of the system. In fact, we have a saying that work is a failure in design. And if we don't get the components in the system designed correctly, we pay the price in energy and pollution. And the way that we do that is we understand the needs and yields of all of the elements within our system, whether they're animal or plant, or even the inanimate ones, so that they work in unison and in harmony together, so that we end up being more of a matchmaker and trying to match elements together in ways where one element will meet the needs or yields of another element. And that's really the essence of what it is that we're trying to do. And so Mollison saw all these liabilities. He saw the energy issues. He saw the ecological degradation. He saw the end of phosphorus. The other interesting thing that I think is worth considering right now is that the world passed peak grain per capita in 1986. So that means that we've never produced more grain per person almost 30 some years ago. That's insane. It's absolutely insane. So we're literally one season away, maybe two, but it's probably close to one season away from being in a global famine. And the thing to think about with this is that all it would take is the Ogallala aquifer, which most scientists know is in collapse right now because it's being pumped down too fast. The Ogallala aquifer is the second or third largest aquifer on the planet, and it's one of the most important aquifers to growing grain in the United States. And so we fundamentally have to redesign everything that we do. One of the other liabilities I'll just quickly mention is if you live in Calgary right now, most of our houses are built so poorly and they require the perpetual supply of natural gas in order to keep them warm. Now, heating our houses with natural gas is like cutting butter with a chainsaw because natural gas burns at 1200 degrees Celsius and our houses need to be heated up to 21 degrees Celsius. So with all of these liabilities in mind, I went to permaculture as an engineer to basically figure out how to solve those issues within my own life. And this is one of the things that really attracted me to permaculture was that it's really easy to go around and blame your problems on other people, but it doesn't get you anywhere. And in fact, it just makes you more bitter. It makes you more, it basically paralyzes you, I think. And so permaculture is a design system based in positivism and action and optimism. And wherever possible, we turn problems into opportunities. In fact, we have a mantra in permaculture that the problem is the solution. And in fact, you don't have a slug problem in your garden, but you've got a duck opportunity. Or you don't have a grasshopper problem, but you've got a lack of turkeys in your system. And so we can always flip the problem into an opportunity. And what's really interesting about this is that I started off talking a little bit about myth and this idea that humans are inherently destructive. When I use the word myth kind of connotates this thing that unsophisticated people like Romans and Greeks would do or would tell in order to try and explain a complex world because they didn't have science. But the reality is that myth is our cultural operating system. We still use it today. And the myth that a lot of us are operating on is this idea that humans are inherently destructive. Now, the problem is that if we fundamentally believe that myth will end us sending us to where we're going. I like to think about myth as riding in a canoe down a river. And if you've ever done any canoeing down a river, actually I saw Malcolm just last year in a canoe. So I know he's got the canoe analogy down. When you're in a canoe, you want to make sure that you're not looking, you know where the rocks are, but you actually have to find the lines that you want to ride your canoe down so that you miss the rocks. And so operating on a myth that humans are inherently destructive, you will inevitably be pointing your canoe towards those rocks, and you're going to end up on those rocks. And so we have to change our cultural programming. We have to change the stories that we tell ourselves, and we have to seek out the information that that allows us to thrive. This next 2 weeks after this, I'm going to be basically supporting that belief by giving you stories and examples of how people can be just as positive as they are negative. Now, the first objective or prime directive in permaculture is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. So we have no right to blame anybody else for our problems, to get mad at anybody else for anything else going on the planet, unless we are absolutely perfect. And none of us are, including me. I like to think that it's taken us thousands of years to get here, and it's not going to happen. We're not going to transition to a permanent culture overnight. But the first thing that we have to get right is we have to get our own systems in order. And then number two, we have to get our house and garden in order so that they feed and shelter us. Now, this was really empowering to me, because I started imagining, and you can kind of see the illustration that I've got up here. We produced this illustration for a book that Michelle and I wrote a couple of years ago called Essential Rainwater Harvesting. And we got asked to design this or write this book on rainwater harvesting. And it was a really narrow subject. We didn't want to just write about rainwater harvesting. We wanted to talk about the integrated systems that show up in a permaculture design system. But we didn't have enough room. We only had 50,000 words. And so instead what we did is we produced this illustration to show what a potential permaculture homestead might look like. And so right now, we as Mother Culture kind of encourages us to get into a mortgage. And mortgage, by the way, is French. Mort is death, and pledge, gage is pledge. And so it's a death pledge. And so we perpetually pay money in order to live in these houses. And then we go and work jobs that most of us don't love. And if you do, that's incredible. I admire you, and congratulations. Give yourself a pat on the back. We should all be following our passion, I think. And so we go and we spend most of our day away from our house. And then when we come back, we're so exhausted that we can't do anything. And so we plant a lawn, because lawns are easy to maintain relatively. We just fire up a gasoline powered cow, and we run it around our yard, and we clip that grass. We extract all of the nutrient in that lawn. We bag it up and we send it off to landfill or to a composting facility, hopefully. And then as a result of extracting all that nutrient out of the soil, we go to Home Depot, we buy more fertilizer, and we put it back on our lawn, which makes our lawn grow faster and means we have to go and cut it with the gas cow more often. And so we try and minimize the maintenance on our property, because we're just so tired working a job that we don't love, paying a mortgage or a death pledge that we're beholden to. But what if your home could harvest its own water, could collect its own energy, could produce its own nutrient-dense food, and some of that nutrient-dense food could be sold at a profit to other people? What if the excess energy produced in the house, either from the exhaust fan from your stove, or the bathroom fan from your bathroom, or the heat recovery ventilator, or any of the things in your house that produce surplus waste energy, could be fed into a passive solar greenhouse that could produce 3 to 4 seasons of food right outside of your kitchen? What if there were solar panels that heated your hot water up, that allowed you to take showers that were heated by the sun? What if the solar panels on your roof collected electricity, which charged batteries, which meant that you had a resilient supply of clean and green power supply in your home? What if your front lawn was a forest garden that produced fruits and vegetables that were the most delicious things you'd ever tasted, without ever having to start a gas-powered cow up to mow a lawn? And what if the food scraps that came out of your kitchen were able to feed a flock of chickens that produced manure that made better vegetables and gave you a supply of nutrient-dense, fresh eggs on a daily basis? This is what we're talking about. And that is the dream. of being able to reclaim our life energy, because that is ultimately the only currency we have when we're on this planet, is the hours of life energy that we've been allotted while we're here. And every one of those life hours should be put towards something that that makes the world better. And if we do it right, not only can we meet our own objectives as humans, but we can actually ensure that the planet is better when we leave it behind. And so central to permaculture is an ethic. And this is probably the most important thing in the entire system. Right now on Earth, we have hundreds of religions. We have people that are not religious. We have different political motivations. We have people coming from all walks of life. And we have this really bad habit of delineating human beings based upon the labels that we apply to each other. And you know what? We're all in this canoe together. We're all rowing together. We should be. We're all from the same species. And Mollison looked back on civilizations that had collapsed and ones that had survived. And I would argue that right now, our civilization is heading towards collapse, unfortunately. But I don't think it has to be that way. The civilizations that managed to thrive for thousands of years had an ethic, and that ethic was based out of these three ideas. Care of Earth really encapsulates the environmental ethic. And so environmentalism, I would argue, has failed in the last 30 years. Its motives were good, save the planet, we need the planet, but the way that they went about doing it was not super strategic, because, and it's amazing how often I get somebody from Greenpeace or formerly from Greenpeace taking my course, because they burn people out. They don't take care of people. And so we can't just take care of the earth, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to have that people care. And if we don't take care of ourselves, we definitely can't take care of the planet. We can't take care of other people. So earth care and people care. And then the last one is future care. And so this brings in that indigenous ethic of 7 generations thinking. So how are the actions that I'm taking today going to impact the future 7 generations into the future? And when you bring all those 3 things together, it doesn't matter how you're delineated as a human being on this planet. We all want clean air. We will all want our kids to get educated. We all want nutrient-dense food. And we all want to be surrounded by the people that we love. We just want joy. And the way that we get there is not by fighting with each other, but working towards these 3 ethics. And this picture is really powerful, and it's going to end up in the book that Dakota Cohen and I are writing. Dakota Cohen has taught several workshops for Malcolm in the past, and he's somebody that I work with quite a bit. I have been working quite a bit in the last 5 years. And I think it really illustrates the concept that we talked about a little bit earlier of this idea that humans are inherently destructive. And there's, which I don't believe, by the way, if you're just signing in. And so the 3 paths, the one on the left is kind of the degenerate economy. And that's the one that we find ourselves in right now. The middle path, which is right in front of that gentleman there, is a sustainable path. And the sustainable path has this belief system that how do we just be a little bit less bad? And I would argue that that is not enough. We can't be less bad. We have got to be more good. We have got to make sure that every time we leave a footprint on the planet, it is better. And that is absolutely possible. And we have anthropologic evidence that this can happen. And one of the most amazing things right now about YouTube is that these stories are starting to emerge. No longer do we have to be subject to the 24-hour news cycle, which is completely broken, by the way. And if you're watching it right now, you should turn it off, because it is equivalent to looking at those rocks going down the river. Our brains are wired assuming that there's still saber-toothed tigers in this world. And so we have a prefrontal cortex, and that's the thinking component of our brain. And then we've got the ganglia in the back. And when we focus on the negative things that are going on around us, it shuts the prefrontal cortex off, which is what we need in order to create design solutions. If you're watching the 24-hour news cycle, then what they've figured out is that they have a huge conflict of interest. In fact, that when you are scared, you're more likely to buy stuff, or you're, at the very least, you're more likely to continue to pay attention because they've got attention of the brain in the back. And so while I did talk about problems, it's more important that we talk about the solutions and where we want to go, because we want to engage this front portion of our brain so that we can open up that problem solving, problem into the solution type scenario in our heads. And so the path we want to go on is the one to the right, which is one of abundant water, clean air, nutrient-dense food, healthy and thriving communities, children that are no longer riddled with allergies and all sorts of other ailments that are showing up in our culture right now. So sustainable is not enough. And let's talk a little bit about what permaculture systems need to do and the metrics that we use to judge whether or not they are moving us in the right direction. And this is going to give us a bit of an insight as to where the course is going to go over the next coming weeks. So permaculture systems should produce net positive calories. So in 1940, our farms, for every calorie of energy that went into a farm, we got 3 calories out. Okay, and let me just repeat the last stat. Right now, we have 10 calories of energy going in for 1 calorie coming out. We need farms that produce topsoil. The discourse happening right now in the organic and regenerative space right now, the organic and regenerative agriculture space, get this is going to floor you, is that there's 60 crops left on planet Earth. 60 crops. I might actually live to that 60th crop right now, although if I get my way, it's going to be many more than 60. It doesn't need to be this way. If we have farms that produce topsoil, there's no reason for food production to ever end. The world, Earth, has existed for billions of years, and it can exist for billions more as long as we don't get hit by an asteroid or the sun doesn't explode, which is outside of our realm of control, so we won't worry about it too much. But our farms have the ability to not just produce food, but produce topsoil as well. We can create systems that increase fertility and diversity. So we don't just have to grow one thing. We don't have to grow monocrops. We can actually have our cake and eat it too. We can have farms that actually that not only produce strawberries, but they produce bird species, and they produce wildlife, and they produce insects, and they produce bee populations, and they produce clean water and clean air. They can improve water quality. So water coming into our properties. And when I say farm, I don't differentiate between your backyard, because you can have a small urban farm and an actual farm that's outside of the city. So we can design systems that when water comes into our property, it leaves cleaner than it came in. And as a result of it, our food grows better and our systems work better, because pollution is just an unused resource. There is no pollution in nature. There's only pollution in human nature. We can create systems that provide habitat for other creatures. We can create systems that cycle nutrients. Okay, and so that peak phosphorus problem becomes an opportunity, because now we don't actually have a shortage of phosphorus. We just have a lack of cycles in our system. We can design systems that keep us sheltered, and in fact, houses that pay for themselves so that we're not stuck to this idea of a mortgage. We can design systems that harvest energy and water, that build community and produce surpluses. And it's all possible. We just have to get the design right. So where do we look for answers? Well, it turns out that forests are highly productive. They do all of those things that I just mentioned, and they don't have little garden gnomes running around doing a whole bunch of work for them. It happens all effortlessly. And so one of the reasons we have to stop chopping our forests down is because that there are instructors. Forests, and when I say forest, if you're living on a prairie like I live on, it's really interesting because the native grasslands that exist here in Alberta still, they're I'm choking on my words this evening. I'm so excited to be here. The forests the native grasslands that exist here in Alberta have the same architecture as old growth forests. And so they have the same layers, they're just a smaller size. The same kind of diversity, the same system, the same nutrient cycling going on. And so when I use the word forest, I mean intact ecosystem. And so when we go into these forests, when we go into these native prairies, when we go into any intact ecosystem, all the solutions to the problems and all of the opportunities that we require are right in front of us. We just have to have the humility to go in and observe how she's acting, how these ecosystems are acting, and then bring these ideas back into the way that we do everything. And so I used a word that may be new to you called forest garden or food forest. Well, a food forest is just a perennial system, perennial meaning that you plant it once and it comes back every single year. So an apple tree, for example, would be perennial, kale would be annual. So perennial system that produces food every year, and once it's established, needs almost no maintenance. I'm actually in Calgary today. I'm on the property that I've been working on for the last 10 years. And right there is a food forest right in front of me. It used to be a lawn. It used to consume energy in order to maintain it. And now it produces surplus energy. It creates habitat. It produces food for the house. It is the most, I think, I'm biased, but it's the most beautiful property on the entire street. I've had random people show up at my property, sit down on my front garden box and start crying because it's just so beautiful. Because it's so different than this monocrop of lawn that I'm surrounded by. And all we did was we looked at inspiration in nature and brought it into the way that we grow all of our own food. So this quote really speaks to me, and I think it kind of gets to what I've been talking about. And if you can see the picture in the background, that's an 800-year-old tree on Quadra Island. I was there a couple of years ago, and I definitely gave that tree a hug. And I couldn't help but take a picture of it because it was so inspiring to see such an elder coexisting on this island, and the people living there have made sure that it doesn't get cut down, which is wonderful. And to use something as elegant as a tree, imagine this design assignment. Design something that makes oxygen, sequesters carbon, fixes nitrogen, distills water, makes complex sugars and foods, changes colors with the seasons, and self-replicates. And then why don't we knock that down and write on it or wipe our butts with it? William McDonough. And so William McDonough wrote the book, I think it's called Upcycle. I think, here we go. Just a second. 2 seconds. See if I can reach it. Cradle to Cradle. And the Upcycle. Brilliant man. And I'm sure he's surrounded by lots of brilliant people as well. And the idea is everything we've been talking about up till now, except that he takes permaculture ideas and he applies it to commercial and industrial applications. And so I'm going to finish. I'm going to do 2 more slides tonight, guys. And I know you guys have been commenting lots. I apologize if you've been asking me specific questions. I will go back through the chat and answer those here shortly. I want to juxtapose our current system. I'm calling it the industrial system with the ecological system. And I might have 1 slide after that I might share with you guys just to close this evening off. So the industrial system is a linear system, and linear systems are really efficient, meaning that they're really good at moving material through them as quickly as possible. However, they are not very effective. And what I mean by that is that everything gets pretty much just used once. So we extract energy in the form of coal or oil or nuclear. We then pump it into some sort of industrial something. We're going to use industrial agriculture here. We consume copious amounts of that energy. We then wrap it in more oil and so that we can get it to consumers. And then whatever we don't use ends up in landfill. And this is a system that is designed around the idea of suicide. It is basically consuming itself. We are cannibalizing ourselves in this system, and it cannot go on. We do not have an infinite earth. We are running out of resources, which we talked about at the beginning of this, and we have got to find another way. Now, the problem is always a solution, like we talked about. And The reality is, and we just actually came through probably one of the most important experiences of our lives, for sure my life. I've been watching this COVID situation so closely because we basically saw the controlled demolition of the global economy over the last, and I don't need to go into, I'm not trying to get into conspiracy theories here or anything like that. Our economies got shut down, and they were shut down in order to protect citizens. That was the dialogue that we were told. And as a result of it, it's going to be extremely hard for a lot of small businesses to start back up again. The unemployment rate is really high. And so our systems run so tight that a 3-month blip is enough to wipe out trillions and trillions of dollars and put people out of work. We basically saw the collapse of some of our most, or very close to the collapse of some of our most vital supply chains. And as a result of that, all of us, including myself, felt incredible anxiety as we started watching the dominoes kind of fall, wondering when it was going to stop. And so these emotions that we felt were not irrational. The hoarding of materials was not an irrational thing to do. Everybody, like the news cycle was telling everybody that they were being irrational by hoarding toilet paper. Well, that was just the newspaper sensationalizing things. Yes, people bought a lot of toilet paper, but people were no longer pooping at work anymore. And if you look into it, it turns out that there's 2 toilet paper industries. There's a commercial toilet paper industry and there's a residential one. And so now everybody was not using the commercial system. They had tons and tons of toilet paper, but the residential system actually had none. Most North Americans only have a few days of food in their cupboard. Like if we went back 100 years and we talked to our ancestors and we told them, oh yeah, we buy everything just on time. Like we have 3 days of food at any given time. They would think we were absolutely bonkers. And so, people started recognizing in this COVID situation that how fragile the system is that we depend upon. And so I want to take this moment just to kind of define the word fragile, resilient, and then the antithesis of that. And so fragile systems, if Malcolm called me up one day saying, Rob, I'm going to send you some of our nicest creamed honey, but it's really fragile. So I'm going to put a sticker on there, and the sticker is going to say fragile, handle with care. We all know what that means. We get fragile stuff all the time. It basically means whatever's inside of that box cannot take any volatility. Any volatility is supplied to that box is going to break what's inside of it. Now, if he shipped something else that was resilient, then resilient things can resist volatility, meaning we can shake them a little bit and they won't get damaged. So something that, like a rubber ball would be something that was resilient. It could take a lot of beating before it really kind of gets damaged or anything like that. But there's another class of system that we can refer to, and that is a system that is anti-fragile. And we all know what this means, even though we've probably never heard the word before. Anti-fragile systems actually improve or benefit from volatility. So the system that we're all familiar with are our muscles. And so if we sit on the couch all day long and we don't do anything, like a lot of us probably have done over the last 3 months, our body atrophies because our anti-fragile systems actually depend upon a specific dose dependence of volatility. Dose dependent because if you apply too much volatility to an anti-fragile system, it actually degrades. And so if you think about muscles again, if you go to the gym at the right frequency and you lift the right amount of weight, then your muscles grow and they get stronger and they are able to maintain stasis and health in your body far better than if we don't use them. And so anti-fragile systems benefit from volatility, which is the opposite of fragile systems. So our food, energy, water, shelter, money systems are all fundamentally fragile. And the brilliance of the gentleman, Nassim Taleb, who I've studied extensively, he has a book actually called Anti-Fragile, and he coined the term And he wrote about it in his book, Anti-Fragile, which is a very hard book to read, but I highly recommend. It's worth getting through. If you're going to read it, listen to it on Audible. It'll be far more palatable than trying to read the book in a conventional form. And he said, you never need to know how a system is going to come down, how a system is going to break. The only thing that you need to know is if a system is fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile. And so we can say that the majority of the systems that we depend upon as modern Western people, even as 21st century humans, are definitely in the fragile realm. We're watching right now, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to our financial system in the coming months. The food system, like all of these central meat packing plants, not only are they producing or packing toxic meat that comes from confined animal feeding operations, but they're all centralized. And so one person gets sick and the whole factory gets shut down. There goes your food supply. In 2013, Calgary went underwater, a large part of it. And we were within hours of losing our entire water system because of the amount of dirty water that was entering into the water treatment plants. That would have been, we would have had to close Calgary down at that point. It would have been a state of emergency and people would have had to evacuate. So our water system is even fragile. Natural gas is the one system out of everything we depend upon that's fairly resilient, but it is still subject to peak natural gas. And so we don't have to know what will bring the system down. We just have to be able to determine whether that system is fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile. And I think you would all agree with me that surrounding ourselves with systems that are anti-fragile is what we actually want. And if you do that, then this last COVID situation, if we have to go through it again with an anti-fragile system, becomes fairly easy to weather. And so the other system the system that we can model our permaculture systems on is nature. And so nature is fundamentally based in webs. Every element in the system feeds a different element. And so the waste products from one element become the opportunity for another element. And the more connections we have in the system, the more anti-fragile the system actually becomes. And so no longer do you have a CO2 problem, you have a CO2 opportunity, you have a tree opportunity, you have a vegetable opportunity. Now, the most successful organisms on the planet are represented on this slide. So we've got mycelium on the left, right there. Mycelium is fundamentally a network-based system. When mycelium attaches to a tree, it can increase the surface area of a tree root system by up to 800 times. So a tree puts its roots into the ground, but when it connects in with mycelium, it's basically connecting into the internet of the soil, and it can increase the water capture, it can increase the nutrient capture, and the whole tree becomes anti-fragile as a result of partnering with fungi. The internet is the other one over there, up on the top right-hand corner. That's a digital representation of the internet, which is probably one of the most incredible things humans have ever invented. And if we put it to productive use in a way that's positive and meets our ethics, we can fundamentally change the world for the better with things like YouTube and podcasts and just by connecting with people that it was impossible to connect with in the past, and by putting information. Jordan Peterson, whether you like him or not, he made a comment that said that long form conversations on YouTube, on Facebook, like Malcolm is hosting here, and on podcasts, is a more powerful technology than the Gutenberg press. Okay, so we now have the ability to, and this is one of the reasons actually that the 24-hour news cycle is dying, because there's becoming good information available to people, because now we have webcams and we have microphones, we have basically pro-grade equipment that is reasonably priced, and an internet that allows us to actually share information so that we can control our own myth, that we can control our own story, and we can direct the future in a way that makes sense to us. We have that power with the internet. And the last one there is the human brain. The human brain uses the same amount of energy as a light bulb, about 100 watts, and it has the ability to design energy out of the system. And so this is the device that we're going to use for the remainder of this course to learn how to apply. I keep saying, like, let's copy and comprehend nature. Well, how do we do that? And we're going to give some tools in the coming sessions that will allow you to apply these ideas to your own backyard, to your farm, to your business, whatever it is that you're trying to design. You'll be able to benefit from nature's intelligence by using some simple design tools that you can apply in your own life. Let's see here. So I think I've given you guys enough philosophy for tonight. I could go into another slide, but I'm gonna save it for next week. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, and we're gonna open it up to questions. I appreciate all the patience, and let's go to the top. Do you want to start with yours on Facebook, or do you want me to start here on Zoom?
Let's start with Zoom. We've definitely got people watching on Facebook, but more questions have come through. So Peaceful Jeff has a couple. If you just scroll up a little bit. First one, is there a database or a book or list of materials and their installation properties or ratings?
So coming back to the internet, you can look up any R value on Google. I would just type in R value of wood, R value of Roxel, R value of whatever, and you'll find it. And if you're buying building products that have an installative value, they will typically have either an R value, or if you're in Canada, it'll typically have an RSI value, which is Résistance Système International, and it's a metric rating for installative properties.
Okay, that's awesome. So the next one was, I know it differs among climate zones and soil types, but is there a rule of thumb to how much square footage or meters is needed to meet the majority of one person's food needs?
That's going to depend on your diet and what you're consuming. If you're living in, if you're eating an omnivorous diet in Calgary, let's say, what I can tell you is that on our 5,000 square foot lot, we are able to produce all of our vegetables, greens, in our kitchen garden, greens for sure. And then we end up with tomatoes out of our passive solar greenhouse and fruit out of our front yard for about 3 months of the year. Dakota Cohen, who I mentioned once in this conversation, grows all of their food in a 1/4 acre for their family of 3. But they're also feeding all of their extended family as well. And that's all their vegetables on a 1/4 acre. I think a 1/4 acre would be more than enough for 4 or 5 people. If you're going to bring in some livestock, like chickens should be allowed in the city, in my opinion. Same with ducks, maybe even some potbelly pigs. I think you could produce an enormous amount of eggs, in a typical urban lot. So I would say easily on the typical Calgary lot, you should be able to get, 25% of your annual calories if you had everything dialed in. And then the remainder of your food, if you're living in a city, in my opinion, should come from, I'm gonna actually put a little side box in here. The remainder of your food should come from local farms that are doing regenerative ag practices, like Dakota Cohen's farm. So this is going to surprise most people, but if your goal was to eat the most ecologically sustainable diet, if that was the only criteria that you had in Calgary, without growing any of your own food, so if you refuse to grow your own food in your backyard, the most ecologically sustainable diet would be 100% grass-fed beef from Periphery Farms. And this shocks most people. It sounds like a diet for heathens, but the reality is that the inefficiency of the cow, this is what everybody talks about in Cowspiracy and these documentaries that have come out about meat. And I should say, I do not support confined animal feeding operations of any style, any type. But the inefficiency of the cow represents the efficiency of the land. And so a cow, if it's properly grazed, will only take about 10% off of the land. So it eats all this grass and it eats and drinks all this water, but most of that grass and most of that water ends up back on the land. And if the cow is managed properly, it's actually going to grow carbon. in the soil. So it actually reduces global warming in spite of some of the data that we seem to be told from all, and I can cite research if you guys want to see that. And when that cow, when the end of that cow's life happens, only 10% of what it consumed actually leaves the property. And so this is where that old farming saying that the only thing you should ever sell off your land is what can walk off your land comes from. And now if we think about a carrot from California, 100% of what ends up in that carrot leaves the field. None of it goes back. And so carrots, when compared to, and it's not that we shouldn't eat carrots, it's that the carrots that we eat should be grown in our own soil or as close to our property as possible. And so in our province, in Alberta, we are surrounded by millions of acres of grassland. And that grass is unedible or inedible to humans, but very edible to cows. And that's where that idea is. And so when I think about a sustainable diet, it's really important to think about that nutrient cycling that's going on. And every ecosystem is going to have a slightly different mix. Now, I'm not suggesting we should all eat 100% grass-fed beef. I think we should have a very mixed diet. I think that's the healthy way to be. But I think that I use that as a thought experiment because it shocks most people. And it's very contrary to the kind of typical story that we're being told right now in mainstream media.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add, and you can verify this or not, but I've heard that bison's an even better choice. If we look at, you mentioned about native grassland, this diverse ecosystem. True fact, we have very little of that left. And in fact, early cattle ranching was kind of culprit for bringing in grass varieties that are literally taking over native grassland. And you think, oh, look at all this like wild prairie. And it's actually been invaded by this grass that's choking out other plants, and it was used because it was better feed for cattle, whereas the bison that naturally exist here can thrive off the native grassland. So that might just take it up just a little notch going to bison.
Totally. And so the way to think about bison and cows is the same way as we think about kind of redwoods and alders. And so if bison is the redwood, and cows are the alder or the slightly lower species in the successionary cycle, I think we should absolutely go back to bison. We got to take all the fences down. We've got to change our philosophy of land management and ownership, which is going to require a Star Trek style revolution in thinking. But absolutely, I mean, you go back 100 years, our topsoils had 20+% soil carbon. We're now averaging around 3% soil carbon right now. And that soil carbon came from the action of the bison. The other thing that we'd have to bring back, and actually I'm working on a project for our own property, or hoping to work on a project for our own property. We have 2 streams on it. And so we actually have to change our belief pattern around the beaver. The beaver is one of the most important keystone species in the prairie ecosystem. In fact, right across North America, there's a great book called Eager, and it's all about beavers. And in that book, they detail out that if all the beaver dams 400 years ago, when beavers were still thriving before the Hudson Bay Company showed up, if all the beavers, the water that was standing in North America was aggregated into one location, it would cover all of Arizona and Texas with water. And so when we got rid of all the beavers, we actually destroyed the North American water cycle. And some anthropologists say that when we lost the beaver, we lost the bison. And then the final nail in that coffin was, and what's really interesting right now is that it's very hard to grow bison in any kind of regenerative system. And most people don't know this. Bison are not malleable and manageable like cows. You can't put electric wire up and have a bison actually respect that electric wire. The electric wire that we use in farming mimics the wolf. So wolves, the other thing we'd have to bring back with the beavers is the wolf. We'd actually have to have a predator here. And so without the wolves, because we killed them all off because they were killing our cows, we've had to make electric wires so that we can keep cows herded up in packs in the same way that the bison would have roamed across the prairie. So first we'd have to bring back the beaver. Then we'd have to stop killing off the wolves. And lastly, we'd have to take the fences down and create an agreement with the United States to allow the entire prairie to move back towards bison. And then in order to support that herd, we'd have to get rid of our corn and soy-based culture and canola and wheat, and move the croplands that we've got back into native prairies and grasslands. And then climate change would be done. And so would the dead zones, and our nutrient intensity would go up, and blah, blah, blah. It just keeps going.
Yeah, cool. Okay, we got a couple more questions here. So this is from Colleen. Are you aware of any learning communities for kids in the Calgary area that are based in permaculture vision and philosophy? Feels like a good time to be looking at alternate ways for our kids to be educated as well.
Do you want to tell folks about your school? Because Plum just came through our PDC.
Yeah, okay. So the Maria Montessori, it's here in Calgary. They used to be at the Curry Barracks, and they've just moved to St. Andrews Heights. And it's kind of like even, kindergarten, pre-ages, all the way up to grade 9. So my daughter, she's 15. She just finished grade 9. And so the Air Kinder, which would be equivalent of grade 7, 8, and 9. Plum Asher is her name. She runs that program, and she's amazing. She, the whole idea, the philosophy around kind of the true to the Montessori spirit is to get kids out in the community. So very key to be actively engaged and learning in that way. And she's very influenced by permaculture. One of their field trips that they did this year was to go visit Dakota Cohen. In fact, on their trip, they visited a mushroom farm. They visited Cohen Farms, which is a regenerative agriculture, all these principles that Rob is talking about. And they went and visited a feedlot just to see the contrast. And, still to this day, like Ono was doing her kind of year end, and they were doing pictures. And anytime a picture of that trip and the feedlot came up, it was just like, right? It just made such an impression. But conversely, so did Dakota Cohen, right? Like that was the kids, highlight. It was the peak experience for them to spend, the day with him and his family, learning about what they're doing on the farm. So that's one resource.
Absolutely. The other one that I would say is Common Digs. They run a forest school here. Let me just change us back to gallery view here so you can spotlight my video. There we go. Common Digs runs a forest school in Calgary, and they're amazing. So if your kids are a little bit younger, kindergarten or preschool, it's all the education is done outdoors, unless I think it was below -20, they would allow them to come inside. And so get your kids involved in anything natural.
All right, and I'm just going to bring up the links to those as well, so folks can see that. And then we got a couple more questions. Okay, so from Shannon, if you're looking for a building material that does not come off the topsoil, is passive solar and meets Living Building Challenge standards while lasting 500 to 2,000 years. Look up sirewall.ca. So I guess that was more of a comment. Thank you so much for that. Any other questions? Feel free. I'm just going to check Facebook, but I think most of them are actually all coming through our feed here. So collect your questions for next week. So next Wednesday at 7, we're going to dive back in. We're going to do this part 2. Man, I was just absolutely so engaged the whole time here. Really loved everything you shared. We all know it in our hearts, right? That this is happening, that we are facing the end of, civilization, very likely, with the kind of statistics you're sharing. But there is hope, there is a way. And I'm going to save my question for next time, which is it possible? Can we really do it? And is it time to move to the cities? Or can we do what you've done in the Northeast? And actually, I did have that question, and a few people asked. So I did post a link to Rob's place in the comments in the Northeast, where just virtually you can go there. You can check out everything he's done on his place, vergepermaculture.ca. He does tours, and there's a virtual tour. Do you still do physical tours, or is that over for now?
Well, we don't have anything planned for this year, but we have a virtual tour right now so that you can take a look at. But keep an eye on our newsletter if you're looking for tours of our urban property.
Yeah. Okay. So if folks want to join the newsletter, we're gonna do a follow-up email. You'll get a link to this call so you can watch it. Please do share with your friends. Let's get an even bigger group going for next week, for next Tuesday. I mean, this is essential. This is life-changing here. So thanks everyone for being on. Keep your questions over the week ruminating, and bring them to the call next week. We're so fortunate to have Rob sharing his time with us. And yeah, I want to thank again everyone for being on the call, and thanks for Rob.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed being here with you guys tonight, and we'll see you guys all on the next session.
All right, wonderful. Have a good night, everyone. All right, wonderful. As everyone kind of signs off here, what was the, I'm just going to add that link. So we mentioned the Maria Montessori, and then what was the one you mentioned? I was listening.
Common digs.
Common digs. Okay, I'll get that and bring that up for folks as well.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll see you next week.
Okay, really, really appreciate it. Loved it. And if you got some time, I don't know if I even have time, but we'll connect while you're here in town.
Sounds good, man. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good night, everyone.
Peace. Yeah.
All right. There it is, Colleen. It's Verge Permaculture.